Hello, everybody, and good evening to our space of the year. This is a very exciting Twitter space because it's slightly different to some of the ones we've done last year, where we've talked about very specific things to do with living with dementia, people living with dementia. This evening, we're going to be talking about something that's very specific and important to us, actually, at Dementia UK as a nurse-led charity, and also something that I hope will be really interesting to other people listening. So, very shortly, I'm going to do you a quick house to and give you some information about the space and what it'll look like. But I'm just going to check that my speakers can unmute and say hello, and just invite them to come onto the stage and just quickly say who they are and obviously where they work. And then I'll tell everybody else what the evening's going to look like, how to use the space, and then we'll launch into our conversation. So, Paul, can I just check that you're able to speak? Say hello.
Yeah, I can. Well, hopefully, if you can hear me, Vic.
We can hear you.
I'm Paul. I'm Director of Clinical Services at Dementia UK. It's really great to be here to have a chat about this subject.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Paul. Rachel, do you want to just come and say hello too?
And I'm keeping fingers crossed you can hear me too. Good evening, everyone. My name's Rachel Johnstone, and I'm a Regional Account Manager for Dementia UK. Great to see so many people joining us.
Perfect, thank you. And actually, what a relief to be able to have your speakers speak in these kind of things. It's always an important moment where I hold my breath. So delighted that you're all here, and like Rachel said, fantastic to see so many people in the space. Just going to give you a very quick run through, just in case you've not done this type of thing before, so you know how to use this platform, how to engage with us this evening. So at the bottom of your screen, if you're on a mobile, you should see a little sign which looks like a heart with a plus in the corner of it. That sign's really useful because it allows you to send us emojis and let us know that you're listening, you can hear us, lets you interact with what we're saying, so you can send us various different emojis. And it just, as a speaker, it's really reassuring because it means that we know that people are listening to us, that you're hearing us, and that what we're saying is resonating to some kind of degree with you. So if you can see that feature, it'd be really good if you could just open that and just quickly send us some emojis, just so we know who's got that feature and who hasn't. So I can see some people there doing that already. Thank you very much. It's fantastic to see that. Just really good to let us know who can use those emojis while we're talking. Fantastic. I love seeing that. It's great to see that interaction. The other thing to let you know is that obviously, if you're listening live to us this evening, if you're here in the space while we're talking, you can ask us questions. You can do that by posing the questions in the chat box, which is the little speech bubble down at the bottom, and you can send us a question that way. And obviously, we will do our best to answer the question during this time this evening. If we don't get to all the questions, which sometimes we don't, we'll also look at them later on and try to respond that way. So that's one way to ask questions. The other way that you might want to ask a question is to put your hand up and request the mic and request that, to come up and speak. I'm not going to open the mics up for people to come and do that straight away, because it's important that we kind of start off the conversation and lead us into it. But then we'll absolutely be opening the mics up. Usually I open them about halfway through, and sometimes I announce that I've opened the mics, and sometimes you'll just get to about the halfway point and you'll be able to put your hand up and request the mic and come up and join us that way. So there are two ways that you can answer questions. Again, you can only ask a question whilst we're live. So if you're listening to this as part of the pre-recording that's available on Twitter, or if you're listening to it on YouTube in a couple of weeks' time, you won't be able to use that feature. But what you can do, obviously, on YouTube is send us a message that way, and we'll see that through our YouTube channel and be able to monitor it there too. I think that's all I need to tell you about how to use Twitter Spaces and how it looks. I don't know if you're familiar with the platform, as I say, so it's always useful to just do a really quick outline. So as I mentioned earlier, we're talking about moral injury this evening. And actually, this is a term that, moral injury, moral burden, moral distress, it's a term that I would say since 2020 and the arrival of COVID, we've heard an increase in these kind of terms. We've heard more people acknowledging them and being aware of them, and actually, so it seems that COVID actually played a part in heightening awareness of this, or perhaps it was a catalyst for health professionals actually talking about the impact that our roles as nurses and have on us as human beings. And actually, of course, it's not just nurses who experience this. It could be anybody working in a health professional type of background who may also resonate with what we're talking about today. And I think the other thing to mention is this isn't just something that's happening in the UK. It's not just something that health professionals in the UK are facing. It's actually something that we know is worldwide. People are talking about that. So, and I know that, of course, on Twitter we have a worldwide audience. So it could well be that you're sitting somewhere very different to in the UK, but everything we're going to talk about this evening may well resonate with you. So I hope you find it really interesting. I know that both Paul and Rachel are very, very knowledgeable about this topic, so I'm delighted that you're both here this evening to answer some questions and guide us through this evening's conversation. So I do have some questions I'd like to start off with, and to some extent it's up to both of you, which I don't mind who answers these questions or how you structure this. But in terms of for myself and for our listeners, can I start off by asking you some questions to really help define the concept? Because as I say, it's something that people might not entirely be aware of. So what is moral injury, I guess, can we start with?
Absolutely. If I sort of start off by really sort of trying to give a bit of a definition of moral injury, and I think the first thing to be said is there's not really a huge amount of conceptual clarity around what moral injury is. In fact, I think there's something like over 20 definitions that you can actually find in the literature. But put simply, moral injury is the damaging harm that results from being constrained from delivering what you deem to be morally right. And that's usually as a result of circumstances that are beyond your control. It means as a person, as an individual, you get that sense of powerless to be able to uphold and act what you deem to really be sort of morally right. So one of the most widely used definitions is by someone called Litz et al. And that's that it is perpetrating, failing to prevent, bearing witness to, or learning about acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. So I think the key things when thinking about moral injury is just to unpack the two elements as part of that. Firstly, that actually moral injury truly is injurious, as it were, and it can have mental, emotional, social, spiritual, and physical impacts on a person, particularly when something goes at the heart of actually our moral component. That the moral component is what makes us as an individual, and it can be very powerful and destructive to our own sense of moral agency and integrity. And really, the fact that actually what causes that harm is something that has been potentially morally injurious. So I think it's really important to kind of differentiate between moral injury and perhaps other sorts of sort of psychological harms. And Vic, just picking up on something you said around the fact that actually it was relatively sort of under the radar pre-pandemic, which certainly, you know, we've really seen a proliferation of people really beginning to talk more about it, recognizing it, which is hugely important. It's not actually a new concept in nursing. It originates actually from the military, but it was really first talked about in nursing back in 1984 by someone called Andrew Jameson, who actually described it as when a nurse knows the right thing to do, but institutional constraints make it nearly impossible to pursue the right course of action. So you can get a sense through what I've talked about there, just that sense of how it really hits at the heart of us as moral beings, the fact that harm is actually done, and the fact that the cause is quite often those circumstances that are outside of our control. So you have that sense of powerlessness. And just the other thing I just really wanted to say, you know, building on from really the lack of conceptual clarity and how we've still got a lot to know about moral injury. It's not actually categorized as such as a mental illness, and therefore, and we'll probably talk about later about what can we do about it. So yeah, that's probably what I want to say in answer to that first question.
Fantastic. I think that was a really good outline there. Is there anything, Paul, that you wanted to add to that outline, or am I welcome to go on to my next question, which I just don't want to give you the opportunity to respond to anything Rachel said, Paul?
No, I think it was really clear. It is that I think the real key point about things that are out of people's control and generated not within self really that are impacting on somebody's ability to use their moral agency. I think that's a really important point. But as we go on, I think we'll unpack this a little bit more, Vic. So
Yeah, absolutely, we will. And I guess I suspect I know the answer to this, given your introduction, and indeed other people might do there, but as well. But in terms of moral distress, which I know is another term that we hear, and also sometimes the two almost seem like they're a bit used interchangeably. People talk about the two, in a very similar kind of bracket, even in literature. So, can I ask you for a little bit of an outline about moral distress? And I don't mind again whether that's Rachel or Paul.
Yes, Vic, I'll start off with this one. And as you said, the terms are used quite interchangeably, and it's quite a common question that's asked. Although they're different, they're definitely linked. And in fact, the British Medical Association explicitly link the two, and quite often saying that moral injury can arise from sustained moral distress, where obviously that moral injury leads to longer term sort of psychological harm. And it can be quite helpful to sort of think of a bit of a continuum. I mean, I think, as nurses, moral dilemmas is something that is actually part of nursing life, and something that actually is faced on a very much sort of daily basis. And then, and that's something that quite often we're able to sort of process and deal with. Moral distress, if we're moving kind of further up that sort of continuum, is causing sort of a degree of harm, but sometimes again, we can sometimes process sort of moral distress, but it's when quite often we have that build up of moral distress, what's called the crescendo effect, where there's little opportunity to process morally distressing situations. And I think we've particularly seen that quite a lot in the pandemic, and that in turn really reduces our capacity to handle further moral distress, and we get that build up to, in the end, resulting in moral injury, and that deeper sort of psychological harm. So moral injury can come from a build-up of moral distress. It can also come from one-off, real sort of high-stakes sort of situation, the like of which we've seen a lot of during the pandemic. There is, I think, still true to say that from research, that tipping point between moral distress and moral injury isn't really particularly well defined, apart from perhaps around the degree of harm. Certainly the two are linked, the lines are very much blurred. And I think really the key message with all of this, and I think this is going to be a theme throughout what we'll be talking about over the next sort of hour or so, is the importance of really intervening early to enable that processing of moral distress, so actually it doesn't turn into moral injury.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I guess one further clarification point that I think would be useful to cover here is that the other thing we talk about, and a term and a concept that we hear it used in certainly in nursing and across healthcare professionals, is that concept of burnout. And where does the similarity there stop and start, would you say?
I might have a go at taking this one first.
Go for it.
Right, Vic and Rachel. Rachel, feel free to chip in. I think it's a really good question. I don't know about you, but I think sometimes burnout is just like bandied around, and it's used as almost like a blame thing, oh, they're burnt out or whatever. I think moral injury, obviously, there's a connection to burnout because the impact of moral injury can lead to people, having very deep psychological and emotional issues, which causes all sorts of problems in terms of their ability to work and feelings of exhaustion and things like that. But I think it's also worth remembering that not every sense of feeling of exhaustion and chronic stress in the workplace will have a moral component to it. Very often it does, but not every part of burnout has a moral component. And I think that's worth remembering because there may be many other issues that are leading that person to feel the way they do, not just because of some of those moral challenges, to their own personal moral codes. So I think it's burnout is probably overused and misused, um, but also there's probably sort of many factors around that term burnout. It's interesting though, Vic. I think a couple of years ago, the I think it was the Health and Social Care Select Committee um, sort of had an inquiry into workforce burnout and resilience, and they suggested that moral injury is probably a more useful term to describe underlying causes of poor mental health across our health and social care workforce that are directly attributable to working cultures, organisational factors, and systems of working. So there's definitely a connection between moral injury and that term burnout. But I don't think we should just focus on burnout per se, because it kind of shifts the blame to the individual. And when we're talking about moral injury, we're talking about much broader things outside of the individual control that is causing the distress.
Thank you so much, Paul. I think that's a really useful point there. It's about how you perceive the term, and where the blame is implied is very valuable to remember in this conversation as well. So can I ask then, so we've talked about, I think everybody now will get the terms, hopefully understand what we're talking about. So can I move us on to thinking about what actually is the impact of moral injury on us as nurses? And again, open the floor to whoever wants to answer that one.
I mean, I think really, I mean, the impact is huge. It impacts on us as individuals. It impacts on teams. It impacts on patient care. It impacts on the wider healthcare system. It's a really systemic challenging that we're all facing and that we all need to address. Really, just to sort of give some examples. I mean, certainly as an individual, it manifests as both psychological and physical symptoms. Studies have shown a link with depression, with anxiety, with self-harm. And there was a recent study during the first wave of the pandemic that found that exposure to potentially morally injurious events was linked to a 2.6 times more likelihood of actually some common mental disorders. So huge impact on us as individuals. There's also been a lot of research that has shown the impact, certainly around absenteeism, obviously around staff sickness and staff attrition. We know we're facing a huge shortage of nurses. I think sort of, I don't know, 40 to 50,000 vacancies at least, according to a UK sort of Parliament report. And actually, you know, moral injury, moral distress, and again in another survey, 45% of nurses expressed their intention to leave, particularly as a result of moral distress. So it's really, really got to be taken seriously. Certainly causes, breakdown in relationships. It causes individuals to go sort of within themselves. And actually, it can also cause people to morally disengage from patients or try and avoid patient contact. It's a way of sort of trying to protect themselves. So there's also links with moral injury and compassion fatigue. So it's the impact is huge. I could probably talk at least for the next sort of 15-20 minutes just to really get across just what a huge individual systemic impact and on patient care and staff retention. So it's massive.
And I suspect there's also an impact on managers and systems as well, and cultures. And I'm just wondering, Paul, is there anything, not, you don't have to answer about that specifically, but just anything you'd want to add around the impacts, Eve, as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are impact on individuals and teams, obviously, but also if you're leading and managing those teams, and sometimes when you're really stuck in the middle of that between an organisation and your teams, I think that can really impact on you as a leader and as a manager, particularly when some of the challenges that individuals and teams faced are because of organizational constraints to how they want to deliver care, and you're the person that has to sort of step in the middle of that as a leader and a manager to explain or to try and keep your team motivated. That's very hard to do in that leadership role, I think, particularly when there are limited resources, and you know, as a manager or a leader of people, that your teams and your great colleagues are being affected, not through their own want and desire to give that amazing care that we all want to give, but because of other factors. So it can be, the impact can be very wide, but particularly on managers, and we sometimes forget that too, because they're all part of this system and this organisational structure that is delivering care that they're not happy about delivering.
And can I? It might even be that we stay with you potentially, Paul, here. But I'm just thinking about we've kind of touched on some of the reasons why it arises. What is it that causes moral injury in the first place? And I think we have touched on some of this because it's the the decisions we have to make, the things we bear witness to, and just wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about that for a while, Paul.
Yeah, I think that phrase that you just used, Vic, is really, really important. That bearing witness to really tragic situations, difficult situations, where you are constrained about being able to help those situations or try and sort those situations because of things that are outside of your control. So you become in a sort of direct conflict to your own set of values and your own way that you want to care for people. I mean, the pandemic was an amplifier, I think, of these kind of situations, with people having to bear witness, nurses and health and social care professionals having to bear witness to some very, very difficult scenes, difficulties with people, dying alone from their families, difficulties with getting access to the right care and treatments, ventilators, you name it. And I think, having to support teams through those very difficult times who were on a hourly, daily, monthly basis, having to bear witness to things that were outside of their control and they had very little power to do anything about. So I think that's a really key phrase, like witnessing these very distressing times and not being able to act in a way that you would want to, and that obviously sort of transfers upwards through the organisation. So if you're leading a team of people who are feeling like they can't do what they want to do and are bearing witness to these very traumatic situations that their fellow human beings are living with, then as a leader, you're feeling that too, because actually people will look to you to try and resolve those things, and you can't resolve them either because of what was going on, particularly around the really distressing times around COVID. But I think there are other factors also that are really causing it in terms of things like rationing, for example, and limited resources. We see that as having an effect on how we do our jobs, and sometimes that can really create moral uneasiness in the way that we want to practice, if you like, for want of a better word. But Rachel, you might want to add to that, I guess.
I think you've covered that really well, around actually what sort of the causes of moral injury, and certainly what you're saying around sort of rationing and sort of trying to allocate limited resources, working in perhaps that more of a utilitarian way as opposed to a deontological way, where we're really able to focus on the individual patient. That really does have a huge impact, and quite often in the research, sort of working with levels of nurse staffing which are considered to be unsafe is consistently one of the top causes of kind of moral distress and moral injury. And I think, particularly when we're thinking about the role of nurses and just that real kind of closeness to the patient, and thinking very much around dementia care and that relationship sort of centered care, and therefore not being able to feeling powerless to be able to provide that level of care that that family in front of you needs is morally distressing. And the build up of that and the impact that the rationing of resources can have can undoubtedly lead to moral injury. So again, as a common theme, it's multifactorial in terms of those what might cause it. So our awareness and understanding of moral injury becomes all the more important.
Thank you both. I'm going to ask a question in a minute, but I'm also going to just let people listening know that if you do have a question you want to ask, I'm going to welcome you to either put your question in the chat or to indeed put your hand up and ask us a question. But I also want to share something in the Nest, which is a feature we've got at the top of the space, and we're going to share that soon. And that'll be a tweet that Rachel put out yesterday, I think, which has got a really useful model that I'd like you to talk to a little bit in a moment, because I think the biggest thing for me is in planning this session in this space, lots of people asked us questions about what is moral injury, what, and it's why we wanted to do it. And I guess it's that like I said at the top of the session, nurses might recognise the what we're talking about. They might recognise, and this might resonate with their experiences, but there's just that awareness of it wasn't entirely there in the past, and nurses not knowing they were aware, and actually not just nurses, doctors too. I know there was a survey done that I was reading in preparation for this by the British Medical Association, which was saying that doctors didn't recognise this either. They kind of vaguely knew what these terms were, but didn't really entirely know what they were. But actually, when you said this is what we're talking about, this is the impact, this is the symptoms, they completely resonated with them at that point. So can I ask you both, what's the risk, I guess, if we don't become aware of this, if we don't talk about it and have these conversations, and how can we increase awareness amongst nurses?
Well, I think the risks are very high in terms of, workforce harm and all those other things that can lead to in terms of retention and recruitment and all the rest of it. So I think the risks is very high stake not to think, at least get our heads around this issue a little bit and raise more awareness. But I think as a nurse myself, nursing cultures can also hold us a little bit back from thinking about these things. One of the things I remember, and it's still relevant today, is this notion of how nurses need to be brave and courageous and just get on with things and sort things out, and not be too connected and all the rest of it. And I think those kind of cultures and values probably hold us back from talking about things like this that are really, really important sometimes. And I think, innate in our nursing culture sometimes is this, well, we're just nurses, we get on with it, we'll sort it out, we're not going to go there, and, you just need to be resilient and brave. And I think that whole notion about resilience, if you think, a 2-hour session on resilience is going to get you through a really serious situation where there is kind of moral distress and moral injury, then it's probably worth, just raising a wider awareness of moral injury, because short-term fixes, plugging a gap, is not going to solve some of the issues that we've got for nursing and other healthcare professionals longer term. So I think, what we were trying to do when Rachel and I were writing the article, we tried to just design a very simple approach to help nurses and leaders just think a little bit more about this subject. And I think that the first part of that model, if you like, is trying to raise awareness. Because if you're not aware of it, you could easily just sort of pass it off as not being important. And of course, the more you ignore these things, the more they build up, and then people can find themselves in very difficult, emotionally challenging situations. So I think if as we can see that you just posted, Vic, that raising awareness and a more deeper understanding of moral injury is really, really important. Because once you're become more familiar with things like the symptoms of it and what it looks like and what impact it can have, then you can do something about it. Whether you're an individual, whether you're a manager, a leader, it doesn't really matter. But I think part of our job, why this space is so important tonight, is just to bring it into that more general awareness across nursing, so that we can then go through and do something about it. Because left unchecked, the impact of moral injury can be pretty devastating, not least on the people that we serve, i.e. our patients.
Thank you so much, Paul. Rachel, anything you'd like to add to Paul's comments?
I think, you know, really he's sort of very sort of passionately summarised that very, very well. And I think, you know, what we're really trying to do is to kind of to move moral injury into the space where we can all sort of take action, because it's that collective responsibility for us as individuals, as leaders, what we can do within our own organisations. So we really devise the framework to find a way to really try and address moral injury. So I think that the model's there, that the article's there, that's accessible, and of course anyone's very welcome to direct message us and to have any conversations outside of the Twitter space. And we may well be moving on to talk about this, Vic. But for my master's dissertation, which was focused on moral injury, I did quite a deep dive into sort of some of the interventions, and of course those interventions alone are not enough. It's moral injury is absolutely inextricably linked with the socio-political system, with organisational culture, with structure, with how we are as individuals, with how we are as colleagues, with having that sort of sense of team. So I think what we're also trying to do with that model is to find a way into support, but really sort of thinking about the bigger picture impacts. And in fact, moral injury has been called a bit of a canary in the coal mine, because actually understanding more about the impact of moral injury in our own individual organisations can be a way of really sort of shining a light perhaps around sort of some of the malaise that we have within our own organisations and our own systems, and how therefore we can make things better for individuals, you know, for teams, and ultimately for patients.
Thank you so much, both of you, for really passionate and detailed answers there. So there's a question that's come in from Claire Childs, which I've popped into the nest, which is at the top of the screen for you. You can have a look at it. And what she's asking actually is, what can we do to guard ourselves from the impact of moral injury? What should we put out? What can we put in or out of our moral injury first aid kit? And I guess I'd like to add to that a little bit by saying also, what should we do if we think we're experiencing it, or somebody we work with is experiencing moral injury? So kind of two questions I've snuck into one, because I thought they maybe gelled a bit there. And I, again, open to both of you to have a go answering that for us.
I'm happy to start, Paul, if that's sort of okay with you. I mean, really, really good sort of insightful question. So, you know, what can we do about moral injury? And I did sort of a deep dive into sort of 24 different intervention studies around, you know, moral injury itself. And actually really only half ultimately made a difference. And that really goes to what I was saying about just how interventions alone are not enough. It's very much around kind of understanding the wider sort of context and systems and things. But there has been some interventions that have been proven to have made a difference. And these sort of range from things like certainly reflective practice has been really key, and really doing that in non-hierarchical spaces. So doing that in a very much multidisciplinary way, and using kind of real life scenarios to sort of really talk through potentially morally distressing events before they become morally injurious. Because the key thing is to have an outlet to be able to really sort of process some of this before that harm is really caused. And Paul might want to come back to the idea of reflective practice and clinical supervision, because that's certainly something that we sort of practice within Dementia UK. There's been things like also trying to have sort of debriefs after sort of potentially morally injurious events. There's also been, for example, workshops to increase our understanding of moral injury, of ethics, to really get that becoming part of really the regular parlance within organisations. There's also been things like certainly nursing ethics huddles. Some organisations have done what they call moral distress consult services, which provide staff with a single pathway to refer in morally distressing cases and receive the support to be able to tackle root causes, quite often with facilitated sessions with trained specialists, but also with managers as well, and really then taking that learning much wider within the organisation, which is absolutely essential. also, I mean, some people might have heard about the TRIM program, the Trauma Risk Management program, which is something that actually some NHS trusts have taken up. And that's sort of like an evidence-based formal peer support system that kind of focuses again around sort of early interventions, around some sort of psychoeducational briefings and decompressing after potentially morally injurious events, and then giving some access to sort of medical and psychological sort of services. So I think we have to say, in terms of what we can do about it, in terms of what the evidence says, that it is very much mixed, because this is a wicked problem. There is no one size fits all as far as that is concerned. And I think I'll just pause for a moment, because I think I've got some sort of things that maybe we can do as individuals. But whilst we're really talking about the organisational role, I'm just going to pass over to Paul, because he might have something else he wants to add linked to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's if you're a leader of people, what you need in your kit bag is really in that model that we've been trying to describe. So the first thing is all of that awareness. The second thing I think you really need to do, if you're trying to counter moral injury in your organisations or across your teams, you need to not rush in to find every single intervention that you think is going to work. You need to really think about and plan what kind of support and interventions that you want to put into that organisation, because frankly some won't fit and some won't be right. So in that sort of second phase of that model, it's a real kind of, as a leader, trying to get your head around, okay, I know there's a problem here, there's an issue with moral injury. What am I going to do to help and support my teams, my colleagues? And crucially, how does it fit in with our organisation? So taking a bit of time to do that planning phase once you're aware of moral injury and once you've been picking these things up is really important. And then, of course, going through all a range of some of the interventions and trying to put those in place. I think in terms of, you know, some of the things we do at Dementia UK for some of our specialist nurses on our helpline and our clinics. So we have, you know, every nurse has regular peer clinical supervision, and it's kind of a non-negotiable, because some of the things that we know that our specialist nurses get involved with are really complex, very difficult issues in a system, i.e. dementia care, that really is impoverished. So they come face to face with these moral challenges all the time. So we absolutely have a non-negotiable about clinical supervision, peer-led, supported, facilitated, where there's that safe space to reflect on some of those really difficult issues, and also that kind of shared learning from around that group. So that's really important. I think there are other things like, you know, access to those more specialist services that as a leader you might be able to put in place for your teams. I think in terms of the other thing that leaders need to work on, because sometimes, I don't know about you, maybe I'm sort of overstepping here, but sometimes when you know that one of your colleagues is experiencing this distress, there's an awful lot of sympathy, but not a lot of help. So trying to work out how the team can best help and support each other, I think, is a really crucial intervention when it comes to minimising the effects of moral distress that may well go on to lead to moral injury. And then there are other things like, you know, all of the interventions listed that Rachel's just been talking about. But Rachel, if you want to maybe talk about individual things, that might be good.
And I just also wanted to sort of pick up, Paul, about what you said around that sort of sense of team, because that sense of team quite often gives us that sense of belonging within an organisation, which is absolutely essential, and can therefore create sort of a buffer to sort of some of the potentially morally injurious events and challenges that actually are sort of faced within our organisations. And it's something to be really, really mindful of. I mean, quite often that sort of sense of team, it's more like quite often teamwork on the fly nowadays. You know, we work with so many different individuals across different teams, across sort of different organisations, and the importance of having that stable home team around you is really important, as is having that sense of social connectedness, and just quite often just things like really listening to others. And again, there's been some research that says that moral injury increases if people feel they aren't being listened to by those who really should be listening. I think the other thing I really wanted to say as well is just the importance of a responsibility that we all have around sort of increasing our own arc of awareness around moral injury. And Paul, you might say something more about this sort of later around how all decisions we make have that moral component and how we just need to really see things through that potentially morally injurious light as opposed to actually just rational or economic or sort of service decisions, really. So there's been, in terms of sort of what else we can do as individuals, sort of in a kit bag, just mention a couple of things here. So there's a model that's called the 4 A's to rise above moral distress, which is actually an American model. And that, as an individual, it encourages you to work through sort of four stages. So firstly, you ask yourself whether the stress you're experiencing really is specific to moral distress. And given what we know about that sense of violation of our own kind of moral self. So really being clear that absolutely this is the cause of the stress. I think it's really then important. The second stage, the second day, if you like, is to really affirm and sort of validate our feelings. And the best way to do that is actually to be able to openly discuss that with others, which also comes down to needing to have that culture, that understanding within the workplace. So it's an accepted thing to talk about. It isn't swept under the carpet. Thirdly, then, I think it's about really assessing what absolutely is the root cause of the moral distress, being really clear on what is that, what has caused this, and then again being able to openly discuss that with others. And then the final A, as it were, is then sort of being able to act to attempt to reduce moral distress. So some of those interventions that we've talked about, around sort of debriefing, around clinical supervision, around that sort of team support, around being aware of what there is within our own organisations to be able to do something about that. Having those conversations with someone who really, really listens is crucial. The other thing that I quite often talk about, and I'm sure quite a lot of you on this Twitter space will know about, sort of Covey's sort of circle of concern and circle of influence, which is where we all have huge concerns that we face in our personal lives and our working lives. But it's really being able to think from that, well, what actually can we influence? What can we actually change? And really recognising those circumstances which are outside of our control. We particularly talked about that in a sense of what moral injury is, that sense of powerlessness. So really sort of being kind of comfortable with actually what we can influence. And I think also a big thing is just about that compassion. It's about that compassion for others, and about being able to notice actually what some of those sort of symptoms, as it were, of moral injury actually is, so that then we can recognise that in ourselves, recognise that in others, and just to be able to provide that peer and individual support, really.
Thank you so much, both of you. And while you were talking there, I was actually just thinking about, obviously we're talking about professional caregivers and particularly nurses this evening, but obviously, while you've been talking, I've been thinking, actually, do we think families living with long-term conditions such as dementia might also experience moral injury? And is there anything, I know that lots of people who join our Twitter space will be in that situation themselves. And I just wanted to get your views on that, whether we think this is something that actually maybe isn't unique to nursing, and actually the families that we're supporting and working with may also be feeling this way.
Well, I might pick this up. Apologies in advance if there's a crazy spaniel barking in the background, because he's just decided that it's bark time. I think it's a really good question. I think if we, when I think of the people that I work with dementia and the carers and families that I support, they are really distressing times for people through a situation that isn't their fault. Some of those things can be very, very difficult times. So the emotional challenges that our patients feel are there, and they're right in front of us. But I think and actually some of our interventions that we might do with them may be quite similar to some of the interventions we use to deal with looking after the emotional health of our staff and our teams and our professionals. But I do think there's a slight difference in terms of, you know, moral injury for professionals, because I think what we said right from the outside, Vic, was that you know, moral injury is you know, that inability to deliver what you want to deliver because of factors beyond your control, whether they're system factors, organizational factors, and all the rest of it. So there's a unique experience around moral injury for professionals, I think, because they are out of control of how they have to deliver their care sometimes. But there is a very mutual feeling of harm and distress between ourselves and our patients sometimes.
I think I'd add to what Paul sort of said there, actually, Vic, and quite often, as healthcare's professionals' own experience of moral injury can be actually enmeshed with that experience of patients and families. You know, when patients are sort of suffering their own kind of moral injury, as it were, so when experiencing sort of loved ones sort of dying alone, for example, there's no two ways about it. That then, of course, impacts the intensity of the moral injury experienced by the nurse or other sort of healthcare professionals. So that you know that there is that link, and sort of talked earlier about, actually there is a link that says that the closeness to the patient and the amount of time that you spend with the patient and with the family can actually increase that intensity of moral distress. So particularly where you've got that real long-standing relationship, you know, with that family, and they are experiencing some form of moral injury themselves. So, you know, where, for example, their loved one is having to die alone. You've worked really closely as an Admiral nurse, for example, with that family affected by dementia, that there is that kind of sense of sort of moral entanglement as well with that whole situation, and feeling kind of more intensely those emotions that the family's experiencing, because you also have built the closeness of the relationship with that family. So there's no two ways about it. There's definitely links between what families experience and the impact that also has on professionals. And I think we particularly see that with the relationship-centred care that we practice.
Perfect. Thank you so much, both of you. We've been joined by somebody who'd put their hand up and asked to speak this evening. So I've given you permission to join us as a speaker, and that's a lady called Tinsy, Tinsy Jose, who I can see has got permission to speak. I muted you when you came up, but you should be able to hit unmute if you've got a question you'd like to ask either Paul or Rachel, or indeed myself. Are you able to unmute yourself, Tinsy, and ask your question? I'll try and unmute you and see if that works. It's not allowing me to unmute you. I don't know if you're able to do that or not, Tinsy, but it perhaps isn't working your end for you to unmute and ask your question, and it's not allowing me to unmute you, which makes me wonder if you've actually left the space or changed your settings, because sometimes people accidentally request the mic and don't really want to come up and talk at all, but they do that. If you do have a question and you want to ask, just wave at us or pop the question down in the chat box as well that way, or just unmute and ask the question. So can I ask another question here while we're waiting to see if Tinsy does want to ask that question? Given everything we've talked about as well, do we think actually that it can ever be removed from the kind of work we do? Do we think the risk can ever entirely be removed because of the very nature of our roles and our human responses to situations, and the impact that's always going to have on us? What do you both think about the possibilities?
Well, I think you just alluded to it, Vic. I think it's inevitable in our work as health and social care professionals. There will be things that we find morally challenging because of the nature of the work we do. So I don't think we're ever going to mitigate, or I don't think we're ever going to get rid of it. I guess I think Rachel said earlier, as a leader, there are so many elements to decisions and leadership that have a moral component. So because we are in the health and social care world, so I don't think we'll ever totally eradicate it in that sense, because we will always come up with very difficult situations. But what we can do is learn how we mitigate it. What we can do is provide much more support to our people and the people we work with, individuals and teams. Because I see moral injury, as somebody who sits on an exec board, as a kind of moral hazard for an organisation. So when you know that there is a risk or a hazard, whether that's a moral one or a financial one, whatever, what you try and do is put in things into the organisation to help mitigate against those risks. We can't take away some of those really difficult, challenging situations that our patients often find themselves in, I don't think. But what we can do is try and mitigate the impact of moral injury on our staff team, so they're better able to support their patients or their whoever they're looking after in the way they want to look after them. And first stage for me, from a leader perspective, for me anyway, is the recognition of that on an organisational level, on a system level, on a people level, and then trying to put some things in place that are going to actually make a difference to how nurses or healthcare professionals feel in the moment when they're doing things with the people that they care for, but also how they feel in their teams when they've got challenging situations, and how they're dealt with in a supportive way. And I don't think we as leaders have really considered that enough as yet. So we may not eradicate moral injury, but we may well take great strides, hopefully, in trying to mitigate its impact. So so that we don't have people experiencing such high levels of distress and physical and mental health issues as a result of not being able to give the care that they want to give.
Thank you. Sorry, Rachel, did you want to join in there?
I'll just echo what Paul says, and I think the kind of the key for this as well is about that that early intervention, which we talk about sort of as part of our model. It's about really being able to sort of process those morally distressing events before they really become morally injurious. That's absolutely key. I mean, it would be very, very difficult to completely mitigate against that. Certainly that isn't sort of something that's sort of within the art of the possible necessarily. But we absolutely have to do something about addressing this huge challenge. And as we've said, certainly moral dilemmas are absolutely a part of sort of everyday working life. And again, there's been some research that has said that we need to be experiencing some degree of disequilibrium in the context of morally significant decisions, because what does that say about the compassion of someone who doesn't experience such emotions, who doesn't find such things challenging, really? And also the other side of the coin is sometimes that can enable us to actually develop a deeper sense perhaps of kind of self-awareness about what matters to us, of more team reflection and debate and actually all of this that will help us to generally broaden our arc of awareness about moral injury, about kind of moral sort of decision making in the process of looking at how we might address moral injury. Just that process itself will actually ultimately lead to better patient care, better sort of retention. There's such a richness as well in talking about moral injury beyond just its pure sort of mitigation, because it does really sort of highlight just so many complex things that we really need to work on on healthcare to improve culture practices within the workplace, how we as individuals work within that context, and ultimately about the care that we're able to give to families.
Perfect. Thank you so much, both of you. And I've shared a comment into the nest from somebody who's in the space this evening, and actually what they're saying is actually how important it is that we're having this conversation and being proactive and talking about this in this format and this forum this evening, and actually hoping and wishing that more organisations would indeed do that to raise awareness, and it's great to see that comment, and so thank you for sharing that with us. But I guess I'd also like to ask, just because as we're coming right up to the end now, is actually if someone's listening to this and they're thinking, actually, this is describing me experiencing this. I think, did my mic go down then?
It did, Vic.
It did, didn't it? I got the message to say, did you catch any of what I was saying?
You might want to start that again.
I will start that again. I don't know where that connection problem went. So what I was saying was that we'd had some feedback to say how important it was that we were having this conversation and talking about this in such a proactive way this evening, and actually sharing that feedback with us. So I was really delighted to see that comment from within the space. But what I was keen to just end with is, if somebody's listening into this space, whether it's live now or they're listening to, say, they're recording at a later date, and this is resonating and it's something they're recognising in themselves, what should they actually do? What would we recommend they do about that? Because they may not work at an organisation where they've got some of the mechanisms of support that we know is in place for our Admiral nurses, but what would you suggest somebody does? And I'm hoping you heard me.
I mean, Paul, you go first.
You go first. I'll follow up.
I mean, and it is very, very difficult because, as where we work, we're inextricably linked to how we're able to deal and process things. And certainly we are really reliant on that sort of support within our own organisations. And it is a huge, huge issue. And sometimes, that sense of being such a lone voice and feeling very alone with sort of experiencing this can actually mean that then people become morally silent, that they don't engage, as we've said, they sort of retreat sort of into themselves. And I think in those circumstances where you perhaps aren't aware of actually what the organisation is already doing. I mean, I think the first thing is to find out what there might be within the organisation, is to see if there are already some things in place. Because I said a lot of NHS trusts, for example, of using the TRIM programme and are becoming more aware of moral injury. I think then really as a basic next step, it's about being able to try and process some of these emotions that you are experiencing, and just being able to open up to a trusted colleague initially, and perhaps then we talked about that 4A's model, in terms of actually really that importance of affirming and validating feelings by discussing that sort of with others is really, really key. And I think the other thing I just really wanted to say is that we've got sort of information within Dementia UK, as you've probably gathered. I'm absolutely passionate about this, and I have done, as I said, my master's dissertation, some research around this as well, and that's just that opportunity for anyone to reach out, to direct message, Paul or myself, for us to be able to sort of talk individually about some other routes and some other options. But it's a case of not holding that within yourself, I think I would say, is that first step. Paul?
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think if you're sat there listening to this thinking they just described everything I feel, then the first thing is to find somebody you trust and tell them, because it may well be that they have experienced those things as well, but they've never told you. So that's the first thing to say. I mean, and I think you need to really find the right mechanisms to support in your organisation. But and if you can't do that, find somebody that you trust to have a conversation with about how you feel right from the outset. There is no one of the things that accompanies this, as professionals, is a sense of shame and a sense of failure and all those things. And I wouldn't want anybody to feel like that because of the situations that they find themselves in. So find a friend. Try not to allow you to think that you're a failure and there's a lot of shame in this, because there really isn't. That's probably the kind of most immediate thing I would say, Vic.
Thank you so much. I feel like we could probably carry on this conversation all evening because it is so important, and it's just flown by, has this last hour. Certainly for me, it has. Anyway, so I hope it's been interesting to everybody who's been listening. Such an important topic, and one that I'm really proud that we're proactively having and leading this conversation with you this evening. I'm going to just be closing the session now. As I say, they always go super fast, so I'm going to allow my guests to just quickly say goodbye to you, and of course they've very kindly said if you want to send them direct messages afterwards, we'll have a look at the questions afterwards. I hope we've answered the questions that have been asked, and of course Twitter is the sort of platform that you can easily follow Rachel and Paul and myself and ask us questions and connect with us that way. So do feel free to do that after the space, after it's ended. The other thing to let you know is that our next month's conversation, we're going to be talking about our brand campaign. Our brand campaign's a live campaign that we've got now, and if you want to find out more about that, go on to our website, the dementiauk.org website, and you can sign up and you can download an amazing resource that we've developed there for families living with dementia, to give all sorts of information and advice. And we're going to be talking in more detail next month about that campaign, excuse me, and also be joined by some people who've helped us in the production of that. So that the details for that will be coming out very soon. So do look out for them and set your reminders when you see those details about our next space. Thank you so much, Paul and Rachel, for your time this evening and all of your amazing insight into this very complex situation that nurses are finding themselves in, and overcare professionals. Do you like to just both say goodbye and then we will end the space? But thank you tremendously.
Just to say thank you hugely for all your engagement and interest and in the tweets. And I'm not an avid Twitter user. I'll hopefully get better. And I will also post up some other resources and papers, which I absolutely loved reading myself. So thank you so much, everyone. And brilliant to have this opportunity to raise awareness of moral injury and bring it onto this sort of platform through Twitter Space. So thank you.
Yeah, ditto from me, Vic, and I also thank you all so much for joining us. This is a really serious professional issue for us to start a discussion about, and I'm so pleased we've had the opportunity. But I also want to thank my two team members on this call, Vic and Rachel, who have, as you know, Rachel is passionate about this subject, really passionate about this subject, and Vic, thank you ever so much for holding my hand all the way through my first Twitter space.
Well, now you've been to one.
That.
Now you've been to one, you've got to come again. That's how it works, both of you. Well, look, thank you so much to everybody listening. Thank you to everybody who spent the time with us this evening, and obviously to everybody who listens in the future. I'm going to end the space very shortly, but do send us feedback afterwards if you wish to do so about anything we've discussed this evening. Thank you very much, everybody, and goodbye.